Hello everyone, this week I've continued work on the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom track we started making last week called Wiggler Wilds. In the first episode of this series, I went over how I created the track's basic layout and integrated some of its major gameplay gimmicks. This week we'll mostly be focusing on the implementation of proper out-of-bounds regions and CPU paths, and the track's broad strokes visuals, including its terrain structure. But in order to do that, since I didn't go over anything like this in the first episode, I think it's about time I explain how Mario Kart 8 tracks are actually put together internally. Any given track in the game is made up of three major elements. There's the course model file, which determines all of the track's static visuals, including model meshes, materials, and texture animations. There's the course KCL file, which represents the static interactive collision of the track, including which parts of the terrain are treated as road or grass or walls or whatever. And there's the course mount file, which contains the placement of all of the track's dynamic interactive gimmicks and enemies, and information that determines how drivers navigate the course. I'll talk more about the distinction between the model and KCL files later on, but for now the main thing I want to emphasize is that so far when it comes to our custom track, we've ignored major aspects of the course mount file. If you were paying attention last week, you may have noticed that the track wasn't counting laps, there was basically no out of bounds, and I didn't show any races with CPUs because those didn't work yet. Now, that's not because I was too lazy to add this sort of stuff, but because it didn't make sense to implement these aspects until I was happy with the track's overall layout. I wasn't gonna meticulously implement proper out-of-bounds regions or CPU paths, only to have to repeatedly move those around to account for the track's evolving layout. But now that I'm happy with the track structure, that's no longer something we have to worry about. So the first thing I did this week was add lap paths to the track. These big blue boxes represent the region of the track that players and CPUs are allowed to be inside of without getting picked up by Lakitu, and if they do get picked up, they'll be dropped off at the position of the smaller box inside. Some of the original game's tracks are absolutely spammed with these things, making it to where you'll never get dropped off too far from where you went out of bounds. But since the plan for my track is for it to mostly be walled off, players are unlikely to go out of bounds, so I didn't see a problem with spreading out the positions of my lap path boxes a bit. I should mention that in most cases, tracks don't purely rely on these big clunky boxes for the shaping of their out-of-bounds regions, but also more specific invisible collision shapes, and I'm planning on adding this sort of stuff down the line as well. Something I didn't have any experience with before working on this track was implementing a secondary route using lap paths, and this did come back to bite me later on. Either way, now that I thought I'd done all of this correctly, it was time to add the enemy paths, with enemy in this case referring to the CPU drivers. This stuff is pretty self-explanatory. The yellow spheres indicate the region of the track the CPUs will try to stay within. I originally decided to try to force the CPUs to dodge the brambles on the track by adding split paths that went around them, but later I realized that that's not how the pokey parts of Dry Desert are set up, so I shouldn't do that either. So, after placing over 100 nodes, including ones that covered the track's shortcuts and secondary route, it was time to check this out in-game, at which point I ran into a funny problem, because me and the CPUs were getting picked up by Lakitu at the track's first jump ramp. This was of course because I'd set up that split lap path box thing incorrectly, meaning the game thought everyone was trying to take the other route where this part is out of bounds. Luckily though, I managed to fix that, and apart from that, the lap and CPU paths all seemed to be working correctly. Then I decided to add item boxes to the track, not just because that seemed like a logical next step, but also because without items it was impossible for me to test if the CPUs would actually take shortcuts properly. Though because of the track's many shortcuts, deciding where exactly the item boxes should go took careful consideration. Since I wanted the drivers to be able to take the grass cut here, I decided to add item boxes to the track's first turn, and that would also of course allow them to take the ramp shortcut. I put the second set of items here because I liked the idea of set shortcuts being a trade-off that forces players to skip an item set. And I placed the third and final item set on the boost ramp here because that gives players an item just before the flower gap jump shortcut. I also added a few item boxes to this part of the shortcut route because making it skip 2 sets of item boxes seemed unfair. A trick I found to make adding item boxes to tracks in a straight line a bit easier is to turn on Track Studio's collision overlay and align things to the grid formation of the road polygons. So after quite a bit of finicky work, the track now had items, and CPUs were indeed using those to properly take the shortcuts just like I'd intended. I have to say, it felt extremely satisfying watching the track come alive like this. For example, I really loved this moment where Drybones and Inkling Boy were battling for first place, and then Inkling Boy took the shortcut route, and as I followed behind the Drybones, I could see Inkling Boy jumping around above us, until we all came together again at the end by taking the flower gap jump shortcut. This also proves that the shortcut route really isn't slower than the main path, because Inkling Boy managed to keep up with us despite taking the turns extremely poorly. The last thing I added to the track along these lines was of course coins, which are genuinely kind of hard to implement in my opinion. Technically, placing them is super easy, again because I just lined them up with the track's polygons, but there are basically no rules when it comes to any given Mario Kart track's coin distribution. So I just kinda placed some around the track in formations that seemed to match the way Nintendo tends to set things up, and hopefully none of them feel too out of place or anything. Anyways, now that I'd pretty much made the track fully functional from a gameplay perspective, it was time to start focusing on its presentation. As you may remember from last week's video, the idea with the big bouncy flower is that it'll go on top of the head of a massive wiggler that's standing in a big lake of poison water directly under the road here. I considered making a hole in the eventual terrain that would go below this part of the track, so the wiggler would be partially standing in a sort of cave thing, but I ended up deciding that it would be much more visually interesting if I made this section of the road a bridge. So I took a part of the wooden road model of Wild Woods and distorted it using a curve modifier to match the shape of the part of the road it would replace. Once I'd managed to line it up perfectly, I also did the same thing for the part of the shortcut route that goes directly over top of the track's lake segment, since I couldn't just make all of that normal terrain either. And this is where that distinction between the track's visual and collision models I hinted at earlier really came into play. See, even though these bridge parts are made up of bumpy individual planks with gaps in between, in-game the player is supposed to interact with these surfaces as if they're just normal flat roads. So I made sure to put the bridge meshes into a separate collection of models that I only imported into the track's visual model, whereas for the collision I made these boxy bridges, which is what the player actually interacts with. So far, this is one of the only parts of the track that uses separate models for the visuals and collision of a single element, but I don't doubt that we'll do a lot more stuff like this as we continue to add more visual details. For now though, I decided it was time to start working on the track's terrain. In order to explain this process, allow me to quickly ramble about how the game's terrain tends to be implemented. Most Mario Kart 8 tracks feature one unique type of cliff material with repeating shapes that are sort of baked into the formation of the terrain of that track. Like if we look at the Shy Guy Falls cliffs, you can see the same pattern again and again because the shape of this mesh is determined by the pattern of the textures that are applied to it. The other noteworthy part of the game's terrain is its layer cake design. Most track environments are made up of interconnected stacks of terrain blobs with grass on top that break up the otherwise repetitive cliff patterns. Now, back when I first started making custom tracks and barely knew anything about 3D modeling, the idea of recreating this sort of formation was very daunting, so I mostly relied on stealing pieces of terrain from the original game's tracks. But that became less and less of a viable option as my tracks became more and more complicated, so I did have to learn to make terrain from scratch at a certain point. My technique at this time was to make a simple, usually circular grass shape, extend some walls down from that, apply a texture to it, and then manually drag around some of the vertices to make the cliff look somewhat organic. The funny thing about this is that if we look at my track Moo Moo Mountain, these simple rounded terrain blobs appear right alongside the very detailed good-looking ones I stole from the original game. Later I did learn that pushing around some vertices isn't enough to make interesting terrain, so I started actually molding the cliff faces to be distorted in a way that matches the shape of the cliff texture. So when it came to modeling terrain for Wiggler Wilds, my technique wasn't really that different from what I described before. I've just gotten way better at knowing how to mess with the walls to add visual detail to them in a way that matches the way cliffs are modeled in the original game. So I started by modeling the grass that goes on top of the eventual terrain, which in many cases I had to attach to the roads we'd modeled previously. Then I extended those shapes downward, applied a cliff texture to those extensions, and manually tweaked the vertices of our new creations to make things look more natural. Now, if you have experience modeling this sort of thing, you might have the urge to yell at the screen right now and tell me about the million different modifiers and tricks that can be used in Blender to make this sort of process quicker and easier. But honestly, when it comes to something as important as the track's main visual structure, I found that a process like this is worth the hours of manual work. I know there are quicker and more automated ways of doing this exact thing, but I like the idea that I've personally put thought into the shape of every cliff that appears around the track. This is far from the most efficient way to do this, but it is how I've learned things, and I'm happy with the end result. Speaking of which, after getting the first few cliffs in place, I decided to import what we'd made so far into the game to see how it felt. The reason the lighting of the walls maybe looks a bit strange currently is because elements like these tend to change drastically based on the track's baked shadow maps, which we'll only be adding at the very end of the creation process. Either way, I was satisfied with the terrain I'd made so far. It really ties the shortcut route in particular together in a way that looks quite nice. But before I could continue working on this stuff, I had to make a big decision. See, like I mentioned earlier, although I was always planning on having this flower be on top of the head of a massive wiggler standing in a poison water lake below the track, coming up with that idea was one thing and executing it something else. But I wouldn't be able to know how far these cliffs had to extend downwards until the giant wiggler was in place, since its height determines the height of the poison water lake and thus the terrain. So even though I had no idea if this was gonna look any good in practice, I exported the Wiggler actor's model and imported it into the track, lined it up with the placement of the in-game flower object, and then I had to actually make that flower object look like the type of flower that appears on each Wiggler's head. So I reshaped its leaves and shortened its stem, changed its color, checked it out in-game, and I can't believe this actually looks okay. Sure, it's a bit weird that the Wiggler is completely static, but that's why I gave it sleepy eyes. Technically, I should have made the Wiggler even bigger relative to the size of the flower, but I figured it would look really strange if it could barely even fit between the eventual walls of this ravine. Either way, now that I actually knew what the height of the poison water lake should be, I added it to the track model. Again, just like with the big Wiggler, although I was always planning on having the track take place in an area dominated by a massive purple body of water, the outlandishness of this visual still took some getting used to. I also made the smaller lake that's a part of the track environment purple, which I know doesn't really make that much sense since players can drive through this stuff, but I feel like this kind of discrepancy is actually somewhat typical when it comes to mainline Mario elements that are brought over to Mario Kart. Let's just say the purple goo in my level is a reference to the stuff in Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, and move on. So now that this part of the track environment was in place, there was nothing stopping me from finishing the rest of the terrain. So I spent quite a lot of time adding huge cliffs on 3 sides of the track to make sure that despite the water, it doesn't feel like yet another island course, and I also added those cliffs that extend down towards the poison water lake and finished up all the other terrain blobs. I'm kinda glossing over this process because there really isn't that much for me to talk about, but I should make it clear that this was by far the most time-consuming part of this week's work. I can talk about how much I prefer manually modeling the cliffs for as long as I like, but that doesn't make said process any more efficient. Shaping these terrain blobs took like maybe a dozen hours. One other thing I did around this time was add waterfalls to the track. I was always planning on having this part feature a waterfall, but when working on the terrain I noticed that this would be the perfect spot for another one. The waterfalls don't really look that amazing yet, but I'm planning on improving them at a later date. And yeah, that's all I did this week, so now let's go check out the track in-game. And here we are. So as you can see, I've decided to turn on CPUs for this gameplay showcase for now at least. And that's just to show that, like, yeah, this is working now. This is one of the big things we did this week. And like I talked about earlier as well, there's something really validating and just, like, nice about seeing CPUs interact with the track in the way you'd hoped. It just kind of makes it all feel a lot more official all of a sudden, even though obviously the track isn't even close to done. It just kind of, yeah, that tells me that, like, okay, if CPUs can interact with this stuff, then I imagine normal human drivers will also be able to do so, and that just kind of means that, yeah, the track is working from a gameplay perspective. And you can see right now we're kind of following King Boo here, who's decided to take the shortcut route, and that's all going very well, and he took that successfully, and we did it as well, and we also, like, gained some positions. So it's good to know that that shortcut route actually is sort of a valid way to progress through the track. Yeah, I'm not really sure if there's anything else I want to say about the CPUs, but I do still want to say a lot more about the track itself, so let's move on to a time trial playthrough of this track. So, yeah, there's a lot to talk about in terms of how the track has evolved visually, of course. So, for example, there are all these cliffs now all over the place, basically. And I do think this has, in a way, almost made the track look more bland, because now there's, like, less to look at in a lot of cases because we can't see the track sort of off in the distance. But of course, my plan is to eventually make the track fully detailed and spammed with all sorts of different interesting things to look at. So I'm also planning on having some stuff right at the start here to make sure that while you're waiting for the race to start, there's gonna be something here. I'm not sure yet, honestly, what. That's just gonna, like, catch your eye and be something to look at, because if you look at most of the original game's tracks, that's also how they're designed. You may have also noticed how here I took away the bramble that was here before, because like I talked about last week, that whole shortcut I did didn't really work. But I am gonna have something else here, probably just some part of the terrain or something, that'll, like, make that shortcut still somewhat more interesting than just cutting across grass. I guess I've also set up the paths a bit incorrectly, because you definitely shouldn't be picked up by Lakitu right there, but whatever. And yeah, you can see all these, like, lower pieces of terrain right here, like in front of us and also behind us. And the idea is that we can fill all of those with, like, more visually interesting stuff that the player won't necessarily be able to get to, because obviously the terrain prevents them from doing so, but they can still look at that stuff. And again, if you look at the original game's tracks, that's also often how they're designed, in terms of having this sort of, like, slightly inaccessible terrain that actually contains most of the visual details and whatnot. But we'll be focusing on that kind of stuff next week. Yeah, but we have cliffs all around the track now. Like I talked about earlier, the lighting on the cliffs maybe looks a bit strange in places, like it looks a bit bright and just contrasty and whatnot. But that kind of stuff will probably be improved by the time we add bake maps to the track. You can see here I kind of curved the road mesh of the shortcut route, or the start of the shortcut route here, in a way that looks really strange because I didn't properly UV map that yet. But of course, once again, none of the visuals are final, so that will be improved at a later date. And speaking of which, these visuals aren't final either yet. I'm gonna have a whole, like, sort of tunnel system thing that the player won't be able to see for the most part, but that will still obviously just look visually okay for the Wigglers to move through. And so that will also be the case over here. Currently, I just kind of cut holes in the terrain, which looks really strange. But there is going to be some stuff here for the player to look at as far as the holes that the Wigglers come out of. And maybe that will also be, like, themed to fit the Wigglers somehow. In general, I'm planning on having there be, like, Wiggler-themed stuff all over the track, basically. This is another part of the track that isn't finished visually because, again, because this is a part of the track that you look at for a long time while going through this very, like, flat and straight section. I'm planning on having something here to catch the player's eye, but I haven't decided yet what. And so there's going to be terrain here, and I'm going to finish this all properly at some point, but I haven't done that yet. And the same also goes for like this whole ramp here and whatnot. A part of the track that is visually much more polished now than it used to be, though, is this section, which I guess I can look at from behind. Yeah, just like the bridge, and obviously the bridge isn't supported yet, but just like the visual of that bridge there, and also the waterfall, which also isn't finished yet, and then like the recolored purple lake and whatnot. I think this is honestly probably the nicest looking part of the track so far. You can almost look at this and not realize that this whole thing is unfinished, obviously ignoring the big white rotating cylinder that isn't even rotating yet. One thing I did notice is that if we go underwater, which the lighting here obviously isn't finished yet, currently the material of the waterfall is showing through above the material of the underside of the water, which is obviously not how I want that to look. And so I'm gonna have to find a fix for that. I might have to make the waterfall opaque because it's probably the layering of the two translucent materials that's currently messing up. I'm not entirely sure yet. Yeah, but let's move on to, I guess, well, there's also the giant Wiggler over here, who's looking much better than he did before, because before he wasn't in place yet, he didn't exist yet. And we also have the bouncy flower that's animating, and I think this stuff all looks pretty good. One part that doesn't look amazing yet is this waterfall as well, just because of the transition between the water and the waterfall. I mean, there is no transition really, it's just it just cuts off kind of, and that looks kind of bad in my opinion, but I'll probably find a fix for that. But looking at just like the general structure of this part and the terrain and whatnot, and just like the way this feels to drive through with the terrain on either side right here, for example, I think this all feels pretty nice now. I guess I should also go back to the shortcut route and also show the terrain from a different angle. Alright, so up here the terrain is also mostly finished, and so I really like the way I made it to where there's like kind of these terrain blobs flanking the player on either side. So there's the terrain behind us and also the terrain to the right here, which is actually an overhang that goes over top of the normal route down below. And that just makes it to where like it isn't obvious how the whole shortcut route is going to wind through the terrain until you actually play through it. And I think this waterfall is also a pretty good example of what I talked about earlier, of the idea of having something for the player to look at while they navigate through a section, like kind of a focal point. And so even though the visuals of that thing aren't done yet, the placement here makes it to where, whilst you're taking this shortcut route, which maybe isn't the most interesting thing from a gameplay perspective, you have this kind of a very different perspective of the track, and you actually get to look at the waterfall, which you don't really see during the normal route, and that kind of just perfectly draws the player's eyes to this part here. And then they can, continue over here and just go through the route. And there will obviously be more stuff in this section over here as well. And let's see if we can take the flower shortcut correctly. There we go. And yeah, I'm super happy with what we've managed to achieve this week. Okay, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. If you have any suggestions regarding the track, maybe let me know by leaving a comment. And while you're at it, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. I also have a public Discord server linked in the description, and if you want to support the channel and get early access to my videos, maybe consider signing up for a membership. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!